is clearly unnerving, especially for those of us living in countries, and by that I basically mean the US and the UK, whose policy and communication strategies regarding the coronavirus have left an awful lot to be desired. We're all understandably worried and a bit stressed. We haven't, at least in Europe and the US, experienced anything quite like this. It is literally unknown territory for us. We are therefore hugely fortunate that our speaker today is Robert Shiller, a thinker who needs no introduction, so I'm not going to waste time on that. Thank you very much for being with us, Robert. His latest book, Narrative Economics: How Stories Go Viral and Drive Major Economic Events, focuses on an area neglected by economists, and that is the importance and power of economic narratives and storytelling. With great prescience in this book, he writes about the self-fulfilling nature of pandemics and the damage they can do. Now, Robert is going to present for around 15 minutes, and we will then have a discussion of a little over an hour. Now, during which we hope to cover three interrelated themes: the importance of economic narratives, the role they can play in driving paradigm shifts in economic policy and sustaining those paradigms, and how the coronavirus crisis could play into this. Because after all, a crisis is not just a bad time. It's a time when pre-existing ideas are called into doubt and different ones are needed. For example, the 2008 crisis challenged the idea that policy stability was sufficient for economic stability. Before I hand over to Robert, I know that my colleague Thomas Fricker would like to say a few words about Forum New Economy. Thomas.
Yeah, I mean, we had an exchange on that, Bob, already over the weekend. Just to put it into the context, we originally wanted to give you a very big audience, and we would have if the coronavirus hadn't come, for you to present your book in Berlin with a lot of people, and there were in the first few days more than 300 people who subscribed to follow your book. Now, it's obvious that this doesn't make sense to present a book for such an audience when you're not there, and so we are discussing to do this when coronavirus is over, hopefully in September, October. So that's to keep in mind. So we will be very, very glad to have you, and you will have the opportunity to speak in a longer way and have a longer discussion on your book. The idea of our seminar was originally to use this huge opportunity to have you as one of the biggest experts in narratives, and having written this book in the context of our work, which is designed to search for something like a new paradigm, given the fact that we consider that much of the trouble that we have today is linked to the fact that the old paradigm has gone, and there was this market-driven paradigm which has led policies for a couple of decades. And now when in this trouble, we have a lot of new ideas, including what you are working on and so on, but it seems as if this is not yet a new sort of a paradigm, a new story, and that implies also the question, what could be a narrative? The old paradigm has had a very simple and very clear narrative, as you described in the book also. So that's the context in which we wanted to profit from your work on narratives. So that's just to say that this has been a little bit our intention. So we're very glad to have you and speak and have the opportunity to ask some questions in the context of something where you may now present the main ideas of your book, and we can have a discussion around the topics that I just mentioned. So just to introduce this, I would like to ask you to give us your presentation now.
Okay, so I'm sorry I can't be there. I'm actually more or less self-quarantining at home now because of the, this is my home office. So I want to talk about my new book, and it's about some fundamental assumptions that underlie economic thinking. And I call for a different approach to economic research to take account of viral narratives. So I'm presenting a view of the world in which narratives are like viruses. Uh, they spread from person to person by contagion, and the contagion is not necessarily it's not necessarily reflecting the quality of the narrative, but more of its storytelling vigor, interest, so that people will repeat the story to other people, and it will spread by contagion. So the word narrative is sometimes taken to be a synonym for story, but it's not quite a synonym, because the word narrative suggests that the story stands for something, that it represents something, that it presents a view of the world, even if not directly addressed. I think that we are at this point in history appreciating more and more the importance of narratives, but the importance of narratives in economics is not there yet. So here is the chart that you see here with the black vertical bars shows by field the prevalence of the word narrative in scholarly articles. And this is from JSTOR, which digitizes journals way back, sometimes 100 years back, scholarly journals. So I have looked at the fields anthropology, economics, finance, history, political science, psychology, and sociology. And looking at the black bars are for all of the history in the JSTOR database. You can see that finance is the least interested in narratives. After that, it's economics. Every other social science shown here has more attention to narratives. So there's something about our field of economics and finance that resists the importance of narratives. On top of that, if you look at the years 2010 to 2019, the last decade, marked by the gray bars, you'll see that every single field is paying more attention to narratives. So I think that there is a revolution going on, and that people are more aware of the viral nature of narratives. So we live in a world where there are epidemics going on all the time, both disease epidemics and narrative epidemics. And these may reinforce each other. They may be co-epidemics. So the coronavirus epidemic encourages us to talk about different things, and that those different things then affect the contagion of narratives. I like to emphasize in my book that many narratives are perennial. There's a certain force to a kind of story, and they get retold for decades, centuries, even millennia. Some folk tales, as the Grimm brothers pointed out, go back thousands of years, spread by word of mouth until maybe recently, and now we've written them down. These things spread by contagion, and I think we are painfully aware of the importance of contagion in disease viruses. So the chart here shows for the United States the number of cases of COVID-19 or the coronavirus on a daily basis. Now there is a problem at the end. You'll see that it says for the past week, illnesses that began during this period are not yet fully reported. So I think we're on what looks like an exponential growth path of the COVID-19 virus if you account for the fall off at the end. as due to data omission. I have the same thing for Germany since January. This doesn't seem to be suffering from a recent data omission, but you can see what looks like it's irregular because there's randomness in this, but you can see what looks like an exponential growth path. Unfortunately, we're still early in this. I hate to say it's unfortunate that this thing is not over yet, but we can see based on other epidemics, the counts. Here's a Ebola epidemic curve. We're talking about diseases now here. The Ebola epidemic, it had many different outbreaks. Ebola goes back to 1976 when it was first discovered, and it seems to have periodic epidemic outbreaks. So here's an example from Lofa County, Liberia in 2014. This thing suddenly appeared in week 1 with about a dozen cases. And then you can see there was this exponential growth path for a while, but then it gets interrupted. And you can see that it comes back down. So this is the famous hump-shaped epidemic curve that appears again and again in disease epidemics. By the way, the Ebola epidemic was co-epidemic, as they say in epidemiology, with a number of narratives, including a narrative that the whole thing is a hoax. And yes, this is in Africa. There was a medical study that found that there was a spreading narrative that there really was no Ebola epidemic. Believe it or not, some people thought that, stimulated by all the talk and in response to the epidemic. So epidemiology models this curve. The epidemiology literature is now 100 years old, mathematical epidemiology, and it has a lot of substance to it. Here is a famous model, one of the early models of epidemics by Kermack and McKendrick in 1927. It's called a compartmental model, or SIR model, because it divides the population into compartments. S is the fraction of the population who haven't caught it yet. I is the fraction of the population who are sick and contagious. And R is the fraction of the population that recovers. So S plus I plus R equals N. We'll set N equal 1. So we'll talk in terms of percentages. There's 2 parameters, a contagion parameter, C, and a recovery parameter, R. For narrative epidemics, R would be the forgetting rate. And it's a simple model. Look at the middle equation. The change in the number of infectives is equal to a contagion rate, C times S, times the percent infected, minus R times I. I don't know if this math is, maybe I didn't need to say. The basic idea is that going back on the rising part of the epidemic, the contagion rate exceeds the recovery rate. So you're getting new cases at a rising rate. On the falling part of the recovery, the contagion rate is now below the recovery rate. And so you're getting new cases, but getting them fewer and fewer. So this model, I hope it's clear, has many variations. I saw a recent paper about the coronavirus that had 5 compartments. It was based on this same model, but there were 5 compartments, including an extra compartment for exposed but not yet contagious, and another one for quarantined. So they had 5 compartments. But the basic idea is about contagion rates. And epidemics appear mysteriously because there's some mutation or change in the environment that raises the contagion rate above the recovery rate. And then you'll see this hump-shaped pattern appear. It happens again and again. This is a mathematical solution of the Kermack-McKendrick model with parameters C equal 0.5 and R equals 0.05. C over R is called the basic reproduction number. For the coronavirus, C over R is about 2. So this isn't this figure is not directly applicable to the coronavirus, but it will give you a hump-shaped pattern like this. So I think that we're sort of early on the we're down here or somewhere around here. If you do you see my cursor moving? And we're a long way from the peak, which is probably still coming. They're talking about flattening the curve. That's what we want to do with the coronavirus. We want to lower the contagion rate, and it will still affect a huge. It'll still be rising for quite a while, but it will be less. This thing has 70% of the population infected at the peak, which would overwhelm our hospitals. And we want the best we can hope for is to flatten the curve by lowering the contagion rate. It'll still grow, but it won't be so severe. Here's a couple of narrative epidemics. I just point them out because they are examples of epidemics that appeared out of nowhere by some kind of mutation in a basic narrative. So well, let me start with the right. Bitcoin was a narrative that you probably heard of. I think it had 100% almost 100% penetration through the population. It grew like a narrative epidemic. It grew exponentially for a while, and I assume it's falling off now. I haven't updated this chart from my book. But it seems like we're forgetting about Bitcoin, and it will go down again. Bimetallism is another fad, I would say, about changing from the gold standard to a gold and silver standard that swept the world in the late 19th century. And it faded away into nothing. It had a little outburst again in the Great Depression. But other than that, nobody remembers bimetallism anymore. But these two epidemics, they're kind of similar in their social basis. Everyone wants to talk about Bitcoin. Everyone wants to talk about bimetallism if you're sitting there in 1896. Here's another example of epidemic curves applying to economic narratives. I did a search on Google Ngrams, which allows you to search books for the various banking panics that we had. The Panic of 1837, the Panic of 1857, the Panic of 1873, the Panic of 1893, and the Panic of 1907. All of these panics seem to rise and fall together. There is one master narrative about runs on banks, and they all kind of went up, and they all peaked around 1907, and then they faded away. It's quite remarkable. I call this a constellation of narratives, and the constellation had real effects. A bank run occurs when people panic and think that their bank is going to fail, and then all en masse rush to get their money out of the bank. It's like what we're seeing now with the coronavirus epidemic, where people are going to stores and buying out all the items available in the store to stockpile at home. It's the same thing, but these banking crises were different from a disease crisis in that it wasn't co-epidemic with a disease epidemic. It was just started by itself in the world of narratives. You can't have a bank run if nobody has ever heard of a bank run and has no consciousness of the possibility of banks running out of money. And that's where we were in the early 19th century. There was no talk of, or hardly any talk of panics in banking. It's something that came on with as the 19th century progressed. So I wanted to just talk about a particular narrative that took hold of the economy, particularly in the United States, as another example that seems relevant to our rethinking our assumptions about capitalism. This is the narrative of supply side economics. And here I'm looking at Google Ngrams, which searches books. And how often are these things mentioned? Supply side economics is a theory that says that if we just let the government off the hook and not try to regulate businesses, everything will be better. That instead of trying to stabilize demand, they should just loosen regulations, and the whole thing will trickle down to benefit everyone. So you can see a hump-shaped pattern for supply-side economics. It broke into attention suddenly just before 1980. I'm down here, and then it's been fading away pretty much. Well, this thing stops in 2008. It's also interesting that there was another epidemic that was much bigger at that time. It was the epidemic of Ronald Reagan, and his name was attached to supply side economics. Ronald Reagan was a movie actor in many, not the best movies, but for example, he made a movie called Bedtime for Bonzo, where he plays with a chimpanzee. It's a joke, but he was well known in public, and he managed to fix his name on a theory of economics. And this was so much more powerful than the world's economists speaking out together, because it was a narrative epidemic. He was going to change the world. And I think that the rise of supply side economics had something to do with Ronald Reagan's appeal. Here's another example. This is percent of articles by decade with either the name Ronald Reagan, that's blue, I'm sorry, that's orange, or supply side economics. They match almost perfectly. So it's the human element in narratives that matter for the economy. This supply side economics took such force in the United States that it was a major economic revolution, which is still with us today. But why was it so strong then? Well, part of it, I think, was just Ronald Reagan, who, like Donald Trump, was the talk of the time. Reagan gave birth to he was a witty man, and he gave birth to little pithy statements that could spread by word of mouth, which they called then Reaganisms. So here's an example of a Reaganism. Republicans believe every day is the 4th of July, but the Democrats believe every day is April 15. Now, I have to explain to some of you, I suppose, 4th of July is a patriotic day of independence. April 15 is the day that your federal income taxes are due. So there's a little Reagan joke. Or another one is, you can't be for big government, big taxes, and big bureaucracy and still be for the little guy. It's a play on words, sort of. It's but people love this, and it then had economic effects. I'll close with a description of another specific narrative that was part of this revolution. It's the Laffer curve narrative. So Art Laffer had dinner with a reporter, Jude Wanniski, or I left the R out of curve, Laffer curve up here. He had dinner with Jude Wanniski, who was a writer for the Wall Street Journal, and with Donald Rumsfeld and Dick Cheney, who were powerful Republican men in Washington at the time. And he presented, by drawing on a napkin, a diagram called the Laffer curve, since called the Laffer curve. which illustrated how the tax revenues respond to tax rates. So the vertical axis is the tax rate from 0% to 100%, and the horizontal axis is tax revenue. So Laffer said, if we have a 0% tax rate, I don't know if you can see this diagram, if you have a 0% tax rate, of course you receive zero revenue. But if you have a 100% tax rate, you also receive zero revenue, because who would work if the government takes all the money? So in between, the revenue curve has to look like that. So the punchline, it's like a joke, this story. The punchline is, what is the Democratic tax rate? Here, it's something like here. What is the Republican tax rate? It's something like here. And they receive the same revenue. So this was I don't know if I said that right. I have to deliver the punchline right. But this story is remembered to this day. It went viral. The same time that Rubik's Cube went viral, the Laffer curve was similarly powerful. Why does it matter that he wrote the story on a napkin? It became part of at a restaurant with these famous in America men. It had just to do, I think, with the story quality. It was part of a constellation of narratives that affected our thinking about deregulation. Now, the interesting thing about this napkin that you're looking at, I got this napkin picture off of a website for the National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. And they tell the story that they wanted to create an exhibit of business history. And someone said, well, you should get the Laffer napkin, because it's such a famous item. Now, Laffer didn't have it. They called the wife of Jude Wanniski, the writer, and asked her, he had died by then, and asked her to look for it. Well, I'm telling you a long story. I'll be done in a second here. I'm trying to illustrate narratives. So the wife said, I'll go look for the napkin. And she did find this napkin, which is now on the permanent exhibit of the museum. The problem is, Art Laffer denies it. He said, I can't believe that I did that I can't remember, and I can't believe that I did that at that dinner, because I wouldn't write on a cloth napkin. It's just contrary to a nice fine restaurant and a napkin. Do you write on the cloth napkin? Never. So I think it's fake, and yet nobody knows for sure. But it represents the power of the narrative. No one narrative is dominant, but together in a constellation of narratives with Reaganisms and Lafferisms, we live in a similar world now where showmen like Donald Trump and their Trumpisms are spreading by word of mouth. They've developed a strong contagion. And the contagion has real effects. It affects our economy. And I just will close with the wish that economists would recognize the reality of these stories and their effects on our thinking. This requires them to think a little bit more like humanists, and trying to understand the emotional appeal of certain stories. But that's what I think we have to do to make our economics more relevant. I'll stop with that.